All right, so we're diving into a topic that I think a lot of people find, well, a little intimidating, to say the least. The world of legal cases and how they can impact our lives, especially when it comes to things like divorce settlements and predicting future earnings.
Yeah, it's definitely an area where the law can get a bit, shall we say, complicated.
To put it mildly.
Yeah,
But that's why you're here, right? To help us break it all down. And thankfully, you've sent us some really intriguing cases that I think illustrate these complexities perfectly.
I think so too. They're quite different on the surface, but have this fascinating underlying thread about, well, essentially trying to put a price tag on the future.
Exactly. And that's something that judges have to grapple with all the time, especially in family law cases where you're often dealing with things like spousal support or divided assets.
It's true. You're trying to create a fair outcome based on, what's likely to happen down the road, which is inherently uncertain.
It's like trying to predict the weather, but instead of rain or sunshine, we're talking about someone's earning potential or the value of investments years down the line. It gets tricky fast.
It absolutely does.
So to help us explore this concept of predicting the future in legal cases, you've given us two cases to unpack today. One involves a divorce settlement in Ontario from 2017, and the other stems from a car accident in British Columbia in 2024.
And while those might seem like very different scenarios, they both raise some really compelling questions about how judges assess things like lost earning potential and how those assessments factor into their final decisions.
Okay, so let's start with that Ontario case from 2017. It involves a couple, Thomas and Willow, who were married for quite some time since 1989, but unfortunately decided to call it quits in 2011. They have three children together, Austin, Liam, and Drew. Austin was already out on his own by the time the separation rolled around, but Liam and Drew were still teenagers when their parents split. And this is where things start to get interesting from a legal perspective, because those kids were attending university while the divorce proceedings were underway.
Right, and that adds a whole other layer of complexity because now you're dealing with things like child support payments potentially for adult children and figuring out how long those payments should continue.
Exactly. But before we get into the weeds of the child support situation, I think it's helpful to set the stage a bit. What stood out to you about Thomas and Willow's financial situation at the time of their separation? Were there any red flags or areas of potential conflict that jumped out at you?
Well, the first thing that caught my eye was this significant difference in their earning capacities. Willow had been working part-time at Union Gas while raising the kids, so her career trajectory had taken, let's say, a less conventional path.
A more family-oriented path, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Thomas, on the other hand, was pulling in a very comfortable income working in the automotive industry. And to add another wrinkle to the mix, he'd even spent some time working in Michigan during their marriage, which meant dealing with U.S.-based income and potentially even assets.
Okay, so we've got a classic case of one spouse, in this case Willow, who has prioritized raising the children and managing the household, while the other spouse, Thomas, has focused on building their career. And while there's absolutely nothing wrong with either approach, it does create a potential for financial imbalance down the line, especially if the couple decides to divorce.
Exactly. And that's often where things can get contentious.
hmm
Because when you're talking about dividing assets and determining spousal or child support, those different life choices and earning capacities come into play in a big way.
So how did this income disparity play out in Thomas and Willow's case? Did it become a point of contention during the divorce proceedings?
It certainly did. And it primarily revolved around the issue of child support, specifically how much Thomas should be required to contribute.
I see. So because of his higher income, Thomas was potentially on the hook for a larger share of the financial support for Liam and Drew while they were at university.
Exactly. But Thomas wasn't exactly thrilled about that prospect. In fact, he argued that Willow should have her income imputed at a higher level for the child support calculations.
No, I'm going to stop you right there because I know that imputed income is one of those legal terms that can make people's eyes glaze over. Can you break it down for us in plain English? What was Thomas actually arguing for here?
Sure. Essentially, he was saying that Willow was capable of earning significantly more than she was currently making if she just put her mind to it. He was implying that she was choosing a more relaxed lifestyle over a more demanding, higher-paying career, and he wanted the court to consider that potential income rather than her actual income when calculating how much you should have to pay in child support.
That's a pretty bold claim.
Yeah.
So he was essentially saying, look, she could be earning X amount if she really wanted to, so I shouldn't have to foot the bill for her lifestyle choices.
That was essentially his argument, yes. But it's important to note that the judge didn't just accept that argument at face value. In fact, he pushed back quite a bit, asking for concrete evidence to support Thomas's claims.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. So the judge wasn't just going to take Thomas's word for it that Willow was intentionally underemployed?
It's exactly. The judge essentially told Thomas that speculation wasn't enough. He wanted to see job postings Willow could have applied for, evidence of specific opportunities she had declined, details about courses or training. She could have pursued anything that would demonstrate that she was deliberately choosing a lower-paying path.
It sounds like the judge was emphasizing the importance of evidence-based arguments, which I imagine is a recurring theme in legal cases.
It's absolutely fundamental. You can't just make claims in court without backing them up with solid evidence.
So, in a way, this part of Thomas and Willow's case highlights a valuable lesson for anyone who might be going through a divorce or any legal battle, really. If you're going to make an argument, especially one that's contentious or could impact the financial outcome, you need to be prepared to substantiate it with documentation, records, or any other form of credible proof.
Absolutely. And this emphasis on evidence-based decision-making is something we see again and again in these cases.
I'm sure we will. So we've seen how this income disparity played out in the initial stages of Thomas and Willow's divorce proceedings. Did this issue of earning potential and financial responsibility continue to be a sticking point throughout the case?
It definitely did. In fact, it popped up again when they had to address the question of child support while Liam and Drew were away at university.
Now that's interesting because you would think that once the kids are adults and living independently, the question of child support would be fairly straightforward, right?
You would think so. But Thomas had a slightly different perspective. He argued that even though Liam and Drew were attending university and living away from home for most of the year, Willow should still be required to contribute financially to their support because he was maintaining a home for them. Essentially, he was saying that the availability of that house, even if they weren't living there full-time, was a form of ongoing support that should negate his financial obligations.
So he was trying to argue that by keeping that house available, he was, in essence, providing a form of in-kind support that should be factored into the child support calculations.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Exactly. But once again, the judge wasn't really swayed by that line of reasoning.
Oh, really? What was the judge's take on it?
Well, they actually cited a bunch of previous cases, precedents as they call them in the legal world.
Right, right.
And these precedents basically establish that child support, it usually keeps going even when a kid's off at college, at least as long as certain conditions are met, like still being financially dependent on the parents to some extent.
Okay, so there's already established case law that covers these kinds of situations where the kids are adults but still might need some financial help while they're pursuing higher education.
Exactly. And this is one of those areas where having a deep understanding of existing legal precedent is so important because judges are often looking for consistency with how these issues have been handled in the past.
It makes sense. They don't want to reinvent the wheel with every case, especially when it comes to matters like child support where there's already well-established guidelines in place.
Right. And, this whole thing with Thomas wanting Willow to pay support while he had this, well, essentially a vacant home.
Yeah, a home that the kids weren't really living in full-time.
Exactly. It kind of illustrates this broader pattern we often see in these cases where one party might feel like they've shouldered a larger share of the burdens during the marriage.
Like maybe Thomas felt he had by being the higher earner for so long.
Maybe, yeah. And so there's sometimes this attempt to, kind of know, maybe recalibrate what's considered fair in the divorce, even if that means stretching the legal arguments a bit.
Right, so it's almost like in his mind, providing that house, even if the kids were only there for a few weeks in the summer, was enough to tip the scales of fairness in his favor.
Yeah, it's like he was trying to, I don't know, maybe equate the cost of maintaining that house with the financial support he was being asked to provide. But here's the thing. Judges are looking for consistency with legal precedent, not necessarily what feels subjectively fair to one party or the other.
It's a good reminder that the law doesn't always align perfectly with our personal sense of what's right or fair, especially when it comes to something as emotionally charged as divorce.
Absolutely. And this focus on precedent and documented evidence, not just subjective feelings, what pops up again when we look at how the judge handled the whole issue of extraordinary expenses for the kids' education and other costs.
Okay, now before we go down that road, can you clarify what constitutes an extraordinary expense in the eyes of the law? Because I feel like that's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot but might mean different things to different people.
It's a great question. In family law, Extraordinary expenses usually refer to costs that go above and beyond what's considered like the typical day-to-day expenses of raising a child. So we're not talking about groceries or clothes shopping here.
Right, the essentials.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's more about significant costs
Right.
related to things like, maybe private school tuition, extracurricular activities that require a big financial commitment, or in this case, university expenses. The key is whether those expenses are deemed necessary for the child's well-being and development, not just something that's nice to have.
I see. So there's some room for interpretation there, which I imagine could lead to disputes, especially if the parents don't see eye to eye on what constitutes a necessary expense.
You guessed it. That's exactly what happened with Thomas and Willow.
Yeah.
Thomas wanted Willow to contribute financially to this whole laundry list of expenses that he claimed were extraordinary.
Like what kind of expenses was he trying to get her to chip in for?
Well, there were a lot of back and forths about things like, let me see, university tuition, yes, of course. Then there were some expenses related to the kids' cars, and I think there might have even been something about a trip one of the kids took, maybe a study abroad program or something like that. The kind of stuff that can add up quickly when you've got kids in college.
Yeah, for sure. So what was Willow's issue with contributing? Did she not agree that those were extraordinary expenses, or was it something else?
It was a little bit of both, actually. She definitely challenged the extraordinary nature of some of these expenses, arguing that they weren't really that unusual or that they were things Thomas should be covering as part of his regular child support obligations.
Okay, so she was basically saying, hold on, some of this stuff is just par for the course when you've got kids that age.
Exactly. But her bigger issue was with the lack of documentation to support some of Thomas's claims. Remember how we talked about the importance of evidence?
Oh, right. So it wasn't enough for Thomas to just say, hey, this costs this much, you need to pay half. He had to actually prove it.
Precisely. And in some instances, he just didn't have the receipts, the invoices, or the paperwork to back up his claims. And guess what? The judge sided with Willow on a lot of these disputed expenses.
That makes sense. It seems like the judge was pretty consistent in their approach, wanting to see concrete evidence before making any decisions that could impact the financial outcome.
Absolutely. And this emphasis on documentation, it's not just about being, a stickler for the rules. It's about ensuring that there's a clear and accurate record of financial transactions, which is essential for making fair and impartial decisions.
That makes perfect sense. So we've talked about the child support piece, the extraordinary expenses, all of which were heavily influenced by that income disparity between Thomas and Willow. Did this focus on documentation and evidence come up again when it was time to divide their assets?
You bet it did. And this is where things get really interesting. Remember how Thomas had worked in the U.S. for a while?
Right, in the automotive industry.
Well, that stint in the U.S. came with a U.S. pension plan, and boy, oh boy, did that pension plan become a bone of contention during the asset division phase.
Oh, I bet. Pensions can be tricky to begin with, but then you add in the international element, and I imagine it gets exponentially more complicated.
It was a whole thing. And the main sticking point was how to convert that U.S. pension asset into Canadian dollars for the purposes of dividing it fairly. You see, even a tiny difference in the exchange rate could translate to a hefty sum of money when you're talking about a pension that's potentially worth hundreds of thousands of dollars.
That's a lot of loonies on the line.
Tell me about it. So the judge really had to dig into the weeds on this one, examining all sorts of factors like the specific terms of the pension plan, different methods for calculating the present value of future payments, all that fun stuff. They even brought in expert witnesses to provide opinions on the best way to handle the currency conversion.
So it became a battle of the financial experts.
It kind of did. And this part of the case really highlights how even seemingly straightforward financial matters can become incredibly complex during a divorce, especially when you've got international assets or income streams involved.
It sounds like a good reminder to choose your divorce lawyer carefully.
No kidding. But wait, there's more. The pension wasn't the only financial curveball Thomas threw into the mix. He also received a rather substantial bonus from his employer after he and Willow separated, and he tried to argue that this bonus shouldn't be included in the marital assets because, technically, he wasn't entitled to it on the exact date they separated.
Oh, come on, that feels like a technicality.
Right, but it was a big deal because we're talking about a significant chunk of change here. And Thomas was basically saying that because the bonus was issued after the separation date, even though it was based on his performance during the marriage, Willow wasn't entitled to half of it.
So it became a question of timing and whether the potential for that bonus, even if it wasn't officially his yet, should be considered a marital asset. What did the judge say about that?
Well, this is where that concept of knowing versus receiving came into play.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So the judge really homed in on when Thomas became aware of this bonus program. Because, you see, even though it was paid out after the separation, the judge determined that he knew about the program, knew about the potential for this bonus before the separation was official.
Ah, so it was a matter of what he knew and when he knew it, rather than simply the date on the check. Clever. So, what did that mean for the bonus bucks? Did Willow get a cut?
She did. The judge ultimately decided that a big chunk of that bonus should be considered a marital asset, subject to division. They argued that even though he hadn't actually received the money by the separation date, the potential for it, that was part of the marital pie, so to speak.
It's like saying you can't just outrun your financial obligations by delaying a bonus or something like that.
Exactly. And this wasn't the only time Thomas tried to, shall we say, adjust the financial picture of the marriage to his advantage. Remember how he was saying he had made all those mortgage payments on the family home before they were even married?
Oh, right. He was trying to argue that those premarital payments should reduce what he owed Willow in the settlement, which, on the surface, doesn't seem totally unreasonable. After all, if he had used his own money to pay down the mortgage principal before they were even hitched, shouldn't that count for something?
You'd think so, right. But here's the catch, and it's a recurring theme with Thomas. He didn't have the paperwork to back up his claim. No bank statements, no loan records, no nothing.
So once again, it all comes back to documentation.
You got it. And because he couldn't prove these supposed premarital payments, the judge only gave him a tiny, tiny adjustment in his favor.
This Ontario case is like a master class in why you should always, always, always keep good records, especially when it comes to your finances.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Because without that paper trail, it's basically your word against theirs, and that's a tough spot to be in.
Truth. Okay, so we've spent a good chunk of time digging into Thomas and Willow's divorce case, which, let me tell you, was full of twists and turns and financial maneuvering. But let's shift gears now and talk about that other case you sent us, the one from British Columbia in 2024. Now, this one isn't a divorce case, but a personal injury lawsuit. But even though it's a totally different area of law, it still relates to this idea of predicting future earnings, right?
It absolutely does, and it highlights just how challenging, even controversial, that process can be.
Okay, so for those who might have missed the beginning of our deep dive, can you give us a quick recap of the BC case? Who are the players, and what's the legal issue at the heart of it?
Absolutely. So this case involves a young woman, Jessica, and let's just say, a less than attentive driver named Travis. Jessica was a social work student at the time, and unfortunately, she was rear-ended by Travis. Not exactly the best way to end your day.
No kidding. Fender benders are bad enough, but I'm guessing this was a bit more serious than a bumper tap.
You could say that. Jessica claimed that the accident left her with some pretty significant ongoing issues, chronic pain, cognitive problems, emotional distress, the whole 9 yards. And she argued that all of this, understandably, would make it really hard for her to work full-time and pursue the career she had been working towards.
That makes sense. It's one thing to have a minor accident, but if the injuries are severe enough to impact your ability to work and earn a living, that's a whole different ballgame. So where does the whole predicting future earnings thing come in?
Well, because Jessica was still a student when the accident happened, there wasn't a long, established work history for the court to go off of. So to figure out how much compensation she deserved for her lost earning potential, they had to make some educated guesses about what her future career might have looked like had the accident never occurred.
Ah, I see. So it becomes a what-if scenario. What if Jessica had been able to finish her degree, launch her dream career, and climb the social work ladder? How much money could she have potentially earned over her lifetime? And how do you even begin to put a dollar figure on that?
Exactly. And this is where things got really, messy.
Oh, I bet. So how did they even begin to tackle this challenge of predicting Jessica's lost earning capacity?
They brought in the big guns, my friend. We're talking economists, vocational experts, you name it, all to provide their expert opinions on what Jessica's future earning potential might have been. They looked at things like her grades in school, her career aspirations, average salaries for social workers in her area, all that good stuff.
So it became a battle of the experts, each side presenting their own projections and arguing why their numbers were the most accurate.
Pretty much. And this is where those aha moments we've been talking about can really make or break a case. because the judge is trying to sift through all this information, all these different opinions, and figure out what's most credible, what's most compelling.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half might be from a different box.
And in Jessica's case, there were a few key aha moments that seemed to sway the judge's decision.
Okay, spill the tea. What were these aha moments?
Well, one of the big ones revolved around Jessica's description of her injuries and how those injuries impacted her ability to work. Remember how we talked about inconsistencies in Thomas and Willow's case? How those inconsistencies about the mortgage payments and the bonus raised red flags for the judge.
Right. It made Thomas seem less credible.
Exactly. Well, a similar thing happened with Jessica. There were some inconsistencies in how she described her pain and cognitive difficulties to different doctors at different times. And while those inconsistencies might have been totally innocent, maybe just a matter of her pain levels fluctuating or having a hard time articulating what she was experiencing, they did raise some doubts about the severity and consistency of her symptoms. And when you're talking about awarding someone potentially a lot of money for future lost earnings, those inconsistencies can really matter.
It makes sense that the judge would want to make sure that the compensation aligns with the actual impact of the injuries.
Exactly. And it highlights how crucial it is for anyone who's been injured, especially in a situation like this where future earnings are a factor, to be very consistent and accurate when describing their symptoms and limitations to medical professionals.
So it's not just about telling your story, but about telling it consistently and accurately.
Precisely. And that can be really challenging, especially when you're dealing with pain, stress, and the emotional fallout of an accident.
Absolutely. So what other aha moments stood out in Jessica's case?
The other big one involved Jessica's employment history, or more specifically, her lack thereof. Remember how she had presented herself as this incredibly ambitious and driven person who was determined to have a high-powered career in social work?
Right. She was going to set the social work world on fire.
She was going places. At least that was the narrative. But when the judge dug into her actual work history, well, it was a little underwhelming, to say the least. There were gaps in her employment, times when she wasn't working or in school, and her overall earnings history just didn't quite match up with the image of a go-getter that her legal team was painting.
Ah, so it was a case of aspiration versus reality.
Bingo. And while the judge acknowledged that the accident may have thrown a wrench into her plans, they also made it clear that potential doesn't automatically translate to guaranteed income.
So just because someone has big dreams or the potential to achieve great things doesn't mean they'll automatically get there, and the court can't base its decisions solely on those what-ifs.
Exactly. It all comes back to that tension between predicting the future and grounding those predictions in concrete evidence.
Which brings us back to that core theme we've been circling all episode. The importance of documentation, the challenges of predicting the future, and the power of those aha moments that can sway a judge's decision.
It's all connected. And it shows just how complex and nuanced these legal battles can be.
Well said. This has been such a fascinating deep dive into the world of legal cases, future earnings, and those little details that can make all the difference. We've learned about the importance of keeping meticulous records, the challenges judges face when trying to predict the future, and the power of those aha moments that can make or break a case. Thanks for joining us on this legal adventure, and remember, whether you're navigating a divorce, a personal injury lawsuit, or just the ups and downs of everyday life, a little legal knowledge can go a long way. Until next time, stay informed, stay savvy, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.